Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming. Hope you all had fun last night or feeling better after lunch. My name is Kyle Tobener. This is Alessandro Lapucci, and we're going to be talking about throwing open the gates, trading control for visibility. And just to set some quick expectations, this talk is a defensive, more blue team-oriented talk. We're not talking about any fancy attacks here. And it's a practical case study on kind of a philosophy that we got to test at Salesforce where we work. It involves a tool, but it's not really about the tool. So we'll talk about our tool, but the goal isn't the tool itself. It's more the results of the philosophy. And we're going to provide some data points about our results, which I think is cool because we don't usually see those kind of data points in a talk like this. So like I said, my name is Kyle Tobener. I'm a director of enterprise security at Salesforce. I live in San Francisco. I've been in security for about 7 years, and my focus generally is application security.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is Alessandro. I'm an application security and software engineer with security compliance at Salesforce, where I work on customer-facing applications and internal automation tools. However, this presentation speaks to the work that Kyle and I started about 3 years ago in enterprise security.
And you're going to get two perspectives here. You're going to get my perspective as a manager and Ale's perspective as an engineer. So a little bit of background here. Like I said, I work doing enterprise security. Ale does as well. I think it's important to understand what is enterprise security and what do we mean, because it'll put you kind of in the mindset that we had when we were making these decisions. So in a traditional environment, you have IT security, and IT security focuses on things that IT does, internal automation, servers, stuff like that. In our company, because we are hyper-growth, we don't just have IT doing automation. Every business unit has their own development team, is doing a ton of work. So marketing, sales, finance, HR, customer support, and IT. So we branded our team Enterprise Security to make sure our mindset was focusing on taking care of the security needs of the entire company, not just IT. But this comes with some very significant challenges. When you're IT security, you have a choke point, a place where you can put your focus, IT. When you are looking at the entire company, we are a team of 6 at the time when we started this work, and we had 30,000 employees. So trying to do scalable security work against every different department in the company can be a major challenge sometimes. Let me click right there. Sorry, we lost there we go. So, security people, we like gates. We like to say, you're going to do a risky thing. I'm going to put myself in front of you and production. So if you're going to do that risky thing, I can have input. I can say, well, let's do this. Let's make it less risky. Or no, you shouldn't do that at all. That's a gated process. Security people like myself, we love those processes. But gates don't scale super well. Big companies, the setup that we have working with the entire company can cause havoc for a gated process. People will bypass our process if they just don't know we exist. How do you communicate that there is this sort of security process over here to all these departments who are getting new people constantly? They never know who to talk to. They just go and do their own thing. And then if they do know that you exist, if you happen to provide bad customer service or you're slow, you get a backlog, suddenly it's 2 weeks for review, 3 weeks for review, whatever, they're just going to bypass you. They need to get to production as quickly as possible, automate this new marketing thing that's super critical for them. There's they have no incentive to come to you. And they're going to bypass you if there's an easier way. Maybe they don't like the advice that we're giving. Maybe they don't like the technologies that we're pushing. They're just going to bypass us. So once you're bypassed, you have a significant problem, which is visibility. If marketing's doing all this stuff that we're not ever seeing, they could be doing really risky stuff that we don't know about, and we can't have any input. So suddenly, I'm not doing my job very effectively. IT used to be the key to this. You could go to the people who are provisioning servers. You could say, anytime someone comes to you for a VM, I want to do something about it. Can't really do that anymore. When someone can take a credit card, they can go over to AWS, they can have a new environment for a data lake in like an hour. That is really problematic because it can introduce a ton of variability. Everyone has a credit card, everyone has a budget, everyone's doing these automation tasks. How can I scale my security efforts when there are multiple platforms, all these different environments. It's just really quite a mess. So, Ale.
All right. So, Heroku. For those of you who don't know, Heroku is a cloud platform, a so-called platform as a service, which makes the process of running, scaling, managing, and tuning application as easy and straightforward as possible so that developers can focus on what they care about the most, which is building applications, not worrying about all the underlying infrastructure. And deploying applications on Heroku is as simple as a git push. On top of that, Heroku supports a variety of languages, including Node, Python, Java, PHP, Scala, Go, and so can be used by a variety of different developers and teams. And so sure enough, shortly after Salesforce acquired Heroku, we started hearing about all these new Heroku applications popping out throughout Salesforce here and there. We dug a little deeper and came to notice a couple of things. So number one, you just needed to know someone to get an account on Heroku. If you knew the right person, you could get an account really quickly. Developers were at the same time very excited about the sort of like flexibility and ease of use that the platform provides, which is all great. But this kind of like is concerning for enterprise security because we would only hear about applications if someone told us without any proactive way to get to know about them. So really we had three main challenges. The internal Heroku footprint was rapidly expanding, which, as we said, is great from a business perspective. Developers love the platform, but it was very challenging for a small team such as ours to keep up with the number of new environments that we were seeing coming up throughout the company. Number two, limited visibility. We had really no programmatic way to discover all these new environments. We kept hearing about applications that we had never been involved with. And let me tell you, responding no to someone who asks, did you know about this application, is the worst feeling as a security engineer. Really the worst. And so ultimately, without any hooks into the provisioning process, our gated approval process was really ineffective, and we could easily be bypassed. Anybody, just like Al said, could just kind of go swipe credit card or use a Heroku, not telling us anything. So we began to wonder, what can we do in order to solve for these three challenges?
Yeah, you can imagine at that time we were getting very frustrated because this was happening like quite often. So we started to theorize about what we could do, and we got inspired by a couple of key things we were seeing from the industry around that time. The first was like this concept of a path of least resistance. If developers or, business people have credit cards and they can just march over to AWS and end up with this giant environment that we've never seen, that we have no input on, that's problematic for us. So we need to find a way to provide a path to resources within Salesforce that is more effective than a credit card. So if we can be more effective than a credit card process, we might have a chance. But if we can't, we're going to lose out to kind of these other systems. And so we thought, well, cost then is probably a motivating factor. If we can find some way to play with the cost of server resources, we might have, an advantage. And then ease of use and speed. If we can speed up how people are getting access to these resources, maybe take our gated process out of the way, that would be really awesome. The other thing we were looking at is SDLC, security champions, that kind of enablement. We didn't have anything like that for this process, but we thought that might be a good approach. If we could shift the security effort left to the developers for a small team like ours, any work that they do is just work that's taken off our plate. It's like huge value for us. Finally, we had this theory that we have this gated process, but it's low participation. We're getting people bypassing it constantly. So if we could go to more of a high volume, high participation process that was self-service, we may sacrifice some of the depth that we had in our gated process, which involved like code reviews, pen tests, architecture reviews, that kind of standard security stuff. If we could shift left, maybe have a little less depth, but significantly more coverage, hopefully approaching 100%. Like maybe the math would work out such that we're doing less, but we've kept the same amount of security value overall. So we decided to build a new process using some of these ideas. And so we came up with 3 key goals. We weren't sure, but we thought, what if we could just make it free? Like, we have a huge advantage here. We own Heroku. It's kind of funny math, right? Like, I pay for it, they pay for it. It's still Salesforce paying for it. So what if we find a way to take cost completely out of the equation and just don't charge the developers? They come, they say, I'd like server resources, and we say, here they are, and there's no bill. We thought, well, that's going to kick the crap out of a credit card. Like, you don't have to pay. That sounds awesome. Next, we thought, okay, right now we have this gated process. What if we could switch to entirely self-serve? So developers say, hey, I have this, this automation I need to do for my department. I go to some kind of portal. I request resources. I get them as quickly as possible. And there's no approval process. We don't say, what are you doing? No, you can't have resources. We just say, here they are. That seemed like a really good idea. That really would enable the developers and make them feel like they were owning their own security. Finally, we thought, if we're going to do this, we need some kind of automated visibility. If we don't have a gate, even though our visibility was bad with the gate, we have some. We need some way to replace that visibility with something better. So we thought, let's build a tool that can track all of these environments in a very scalable way. So, I'm a manager. I'm about to get rid of a more in-depth security process and switch it up with something a little looser. I was excited, but a little scared. Definitely an unexplored frontier for our team. So I thought we better find some ways to measure effectiveness. So at least in this process, we thought, if we got to have a path of least resistance, we need to measure, did we reduce that resistance? If we did, we would probably see a huge spike in usage of our process. So we looked at how many environments had gone through our process the previous year and the previous year before that. And we looked at how many environments we discovered that didn't go through our process. And we kind of came up with a number that we thought, if we can beat this number, then we've done a really good job. We've got a statistically significant amount of growth. We also we weren't sure at the time, but we thought if we can make it totally free for the developers, that's going to be kind of a binary yes or no. We succeeded in that path of least resistance. There's kind of a lot of behind the scenes business work that would have to go into that, but we thought if we can get that, that would be great. We also wanted to measure how quickly do they get the resources. Ideally, 100% automated instantaneous is the goal, but there may be things down the line, other teams that have dependencies that we don't control. So our goal was let's get it down to maybe a day or a couple days as quickly as possible so that when combined with the free usage, it would really compete with kind of swiping a credit card. And then we wanted to think about, okay, we're asking developers to follow security guidelines, kind of shift left, be security champions themselves. How can we measure whether that's been effective? So we looked at the properties of a Heroku environment that we really cared about, and we thought we can measure how many users turn on 2FA. In our security guidelines, we're going to tell them to do it. If they do it, that's going to be a really good sign that they are following the guidelines that they give them. If they're not doing it, turning on 2FA is super easy. If they're not doing it, that's probably going to be a good sign that they are just ignoring the guidelines entirely. We also wanted to add a measurement that wasn't just 2FA because we thought, well, some people might just turn that on without even reading the guidelines. So we put in some third-party add-on usage. Heroku has a marketplace a lot like other platforms where you can go and get different add-ons. And we have a list of ones that our company can work with and a list where we shouldn't work with them. And so we thought, well, let's make that list part of the security guidelines and see how people adhere to that list. Finally, this theory of high volume self-service versus the more in-depth low participation gate, it's a little harder to measure this exactly, but using all of the previous measures, we thought we could get to more of a qualitative look at this. If we definitely have a path of least resistance and we feel like we're getting a much higher volume of usage of our process and we get good adherence to the security policy, then we thought we might be able to really understand if we've gotten the right amount of security value out of this process. So here we go. A little nervous. Hi. Talk about the implementation.
Let's look at the implementation. So as Carl said, providing the path of least resistance is key to the adoption of this new process. We so clearly needed some automation to help, and we decided to build a simple request form where employees could provide some basic details and get access to their new Heroku environments right away. No approvals needed. Here you go. So we use Node.js on Heroku to stand up a simple form collecting details such as the who the requester is, the name of the account, the technical contact, the target audience, the type of data that the account will deal with, and whether or not the applications will be integrated with any internal or external systems, amongst other data points. And to successfully complete the request, the user must agree with our security guidelines, which enforces our self-service approach to the process. So in this new process, we'll have a chance to build in a security baseline, while at the same time allowing developers to manage some security requirements for themselves. So as we said, we provide developers with the quote-unquote free compute resources that come coupled with custom domain and related certificate for each application. We started doing this through an automated certificate management system, although nowadays Heroku supports free certificates through Let's Encrypt for all applications. We also grant developers with access to private spaces, which are dedicated environments to run applications on an isolated network, very much like an AWS VPC environment. And those come with static outbound IPs, which are useful for things like integration, where IP whitelisting may be desired or required, as well as the ability to peer with other AWS VPCs. The best part? The provisioned accounts come with a backdoor in the form of a service account, which, as we'll see in next slides, provide us with a ton of built-in visibility. And at the same time, we ask account owners to manage, but we don't yet, at least enforce, enabling two-factor authentication or single sign-on through our internal identity provider. And as we touched on, Heroku offers a number of native and third-party add-ons. In fact, I believe there is 150 plus of those, which are providing services such as data stores, content management system, email delivery capability, login, uptime alerts, and so forth. And so we ask developers to only stick to the add-ons that have been pre-approved, so that have been tested and put on a sort of like a white list. Last but not least, we ask them to please don't disable the service accounts, or we lose all that visibility. So having gotten that visibility into the new provisioned Heroku accounts, we built a Heroku Warden as a monitoring console to report on the utilization and security baseline of those Heroku accounts. Again, built in Node.js on Heroku. It's made up of two components, a web application front end, which you can see here on screen, as well as a worker process, which, thanks to the backdoored service accounts, it runs a set of queries against the Heroku platform APIs on an hourly basis and stores the result in an underlying Postgres database, think like snapshots, so that we can go back in time and see how the statistics were like on a specific daytime. And so the application helps us answer questions such as, how many organizations, how many accounts, users, private spaces, add-ons, domains are part of the ecosystem of applications that we see running on Heroku. It also helps us answer the questions that we asked earlier, such as how many users are using 2FA, how many are using single sign-on, how many of those are not using either. Hopefully not many. And ultimately, of course, how many applications are using approved versus unapproved add-ons. Okay, so let's look at some metrics.
So we launched this process in April 2016, and we kind of seeded that tool that Ali just showed with environments that we had found previously that maybe had bypassed us or had come to us. So orgs are kind of the high-level structure, but we aggregate users and apps. And so we had 50 users, 150 apps on day one. And we wanted to use this as our baseline to kind of make predictions about what success would look like after a year of running this process. Because, we want to measure, are people adopting our process, and maybe can we, understand, are we getting close to full adoption? So here's the prediction we came up with. We expected, based on kind of previous volume and then a certain amount of statistical significance, to get up to 250 users and 250 apps. How do we do?
I think we did pretty well. Let's look at those numbers. So by April 2017, we had twice as many accounts, twice as many users, and a lot more applications than we had predicted. So our customers, our users, were really responding to the speed at which they could come up with new environments and start getting their applications up and running. And word was quickly spreading throughout the company between their colleagues. And so, obviously, a year metrics don't tell the whole story, but we knew that these numbers were growing quickly. And so let's take a look at how things look like today.
So since then, the curve just kind of exploded. We now have 5,000 users and 3,500 apps on Heroku that are monitored by us every hour. And it's been kind of incredible. That's basically 10x users, 10x apps, maybe a bit more than that. And we're still seeing about 5 new organizations hop on board every month. And there are so many great business apps that have been built this way that are really helping our company grow, because people are just able to go from, oh, we need this automation to speed up this process. Let's go to an app super quick. The other nice thing is our team has only grown from 6 users to 10 users. So we didn't quite double, but the number of apps that we've been able to cover with this process is awesome. We would have been crushed, or we would not have seen all of this. Or, maybe the growth wouldn't even be on Heroku. It could be on AWS or GCP, because we wouldn't have had this streamlined process.
Okay, let's look at some lessons learned from this. So we think that the process was wildly successful, primarily because we focused solving a business process or a business issue while trying to solve our own visibility problems. So we ditched the slow and gated approval process that we were talking about, and we're able to deliver the compute resources quickly so that developers could move at the speed of the business. And ultimately, really incentivizing the adoption, we were able to concentrate our users on a single platform. So we essentially swung the value calculation, the value proposition, so far towards our process and our platforms that very few other options, if any, could compete, which was a great success.
Another thing that's really influenced me as kind of a manager of a team is the demand that we saw. So I previously operated this gated process, and it was a little bit slow. It had an unpredictable outcome for the business, because if you got a pen test or a code review or something, and you could walk away with homework and not end up going to production. So there were delays, and there weren't many incentives to actually go through my process. And all of my understanding of my environment was built around that process. I had this conception, and I had these reports that said there were this many applications that we did in a year, and so on and so forth. And that would roll up to my management. And all of that was essentially a little bit wrong. Once I had a better understanding from this, increased adoption and increased visibility, the consistency and understanding of my environment was so much higher than I thought it would be. My prediction was at least double off. So this got me thinking, for as long as I was running that gated process, I was vastly underestimating what my environment looked like, and I was not doing the diligence I needed to be doing to secure my environment. Once I had a much more consistent understanding of what was happening, I was doing my job so much better. I had this consistency of visibility into environments. We had this scalable baseline, which we could then put our efforts into increasing if we wanted to invest more time in up-leveling the amount of security we're doing on these applications. And so overall, I really do think we had a much better security outcome for the amount of time I invested as a manager in securing these resources. So with that in mind, I now look at some of my other processes that I own, and wherever there is a gated process, I now think, well, it's probably being bypassed a lot more than I think, and so I need to invest a lot more time and energy in visibility, asset management where I can, because sometimes a gated process is necessary for legal reasons or all kinds of stuff. So you can't always just ditch it like we did here. But knowing that there are flaws in a gated process like that And knowing that people will bypass it to a degree, probably more than you expect, you can invest in something like tooling, asset management, discovery, to make sure you have that good understanding of your environment and you're securing everything you need to be.
Okay, so let's talk about how the self-service approach towards security worked with our developers. So as you can see here, about 80% of the users on the platform were willing to enable two-factor authentication or single sign-on. So we know that 80% isn't perfect, but it's honestly a very respectable rate for a security control that basically required no input whatsoever from the security department. And so at a high level, we really think that this is sort of like evidence that if the requirement is relatively simple to achieve, it does not conflict with the needs that the developers have to get their job done, and it has a clear security outcome, then users seem to be, willing to manage the requirement by themselves.
I also think it's really interesting. We've been operating this process for about 3 years, and this number has stayed pretty consistent. I think right now, so this was the 1-year number, right now it's at like 85%, and throughout the life cycle, it's been somewhere between 80 and 85. So we swing a little bit by a few percent every now and again, but overall, people are willing to adhere to that requirement about that level, which I think is pretty interesting. So another area where we were worried was the removal of the service account. If they own the environment, we're not, managing their environment. If they go in and disable our access, we can't see the environment anymore. So we measured how often people did that, and it was actually very, very low. 3% about disabled that backdoor. And when we reached out to them, it was mostly just a mistake. They said, "Oh, I saw this access. I didn't know what it was. I turned it off." And then we just said, "Hey, can you turn it back on? Here's why we do it." And they were like, "Oh, great." So we have a really simple report that monitors this now, and it's not a big deal. So pretty much like we've been able to maintain that visibility as we've scaled with very little issues. So again, this is a simple requirement. Don't disable the black door. And for the most part, developers are very trustable here.
Now we come to an area where the self-service model didn't perform quite as well as we had hoped. So if you remember back to the security requirements, we said that developers were only, so we asked them to only use approved add-ons. And what we found out is that only 30% of them were willing to conform with this requirement. And honestly, chances that the number of, or the percentage of developers that are willing to conform to the requirement is even lower. Plus, obviously, there is a set of developers who, chances didn't need any add-ons to build their current applications, but if they needed it, they would have likely used them. So we think that this is likely because this is a more complex requirement that does not have an as clear security outcome, and obviously conflicts directly to the developer needs, because the add-ons provide the functionalities, as we said, that developers need to get their jobs done. And so ultimately, if we had a little extra development cycles to invest in that kind of like a baseline automation, at this point we would likely prioritize a more complex requirement like this, managing add-ons, over things like two-factor authentication and single sign-on, which are much easier to measure and to sort of fix over time.
So we got interested in doing this talk because we started to work on this tool again, and it got us thinking about where we started. So we're making some updates now, and so I just thought I'd talk a little bit about the roadmap. We are going to do a little bit of notification for the 2FA because I would like to see that number up at 100%. But all we're going to do is just send a little email to people and be like, "Hey, you should turn on 2FA." I don't think it needs anything more than that because 80% or more people are willing to do it on their own. So we can just, gently remind people who haven't, and we should get there. For the third-party add-ons, that's a more complicated issue. We're looking at building a whitelist that can manage sort of what you can and cannot install for them. So, developers are probably following the path of least resistance. And, if they need email, they're using an email add-on, which we may or may not have a contract with, and going that direction. If we can provide them guidance or, basically a whitelist, blacklist that says, here's the add-ons that you can choose from, that will probably solve that 30% very well for us. And then we'd like to, in the near future, start working more on some of the application layer things like the code, get some static analysis into the tool, start monitoring for out-of-date libraries perhaps, or even anomalous behavior. If we have non-Salesforce users in the user base, kick them out automatically, things like that. But the nice thing is, we've gone from 150 apps to 3,500 apps, and my team hasn't grown that much. We have the time to invest in raising this bar because we've dug ourselves out of the hole of all of those constant manual reviews of every single app. And not every single app, just some apps.
Okay, so here are some of our conclusions from this experimentation over the last few years. So the former enablement process or approval process, as we said, was inconsistent and resulted in a significant number of missed assets. And as we said, as asset management is so important to help secure resources at the scale that we are talking about, without the broad visibility that this new tool and process provided us, we would have likely overestimated the coverage, the security coverage that we had, and so likely left a significant number of assets exposed.
Yeah, I can just say anecdotally that this tool has saved my ass a number of times when someone says, hey, what do you know about this application? And I can just list out a whole bunch of detail about what's going on with it. And then if there's some kind of issue we need to resolve, we can move so much faster. Discovery, digging in, trying to figure out who owns something, it's all done. So next, a majority of developers are trustworthy without the gated process. I feel like from the 80% that we saw with 2FA, the 97% with keeping the monitoring in place, even with the 30% on the third-party apps, I feel like I'm happy trusting the developers to manage the security themselves. And where necessary, we will nudge them in the right direction or help them out with some guardrails. But overall, I think enabling them to do what they need to grow their line of business and meet their objectives is the right call.
And so ultimately, the actual demand for this process really far exceeded any expectations that we could have possibly had, which that argued that indicates a fundamental misunderstanding from our part in terms of the developer needs. And as security professionals, really, I don't think that we often get involved with the business side of things. But I feel it really pays off to be involved in that kind of like enablement and approval process where, it at least grants us the visibility, just like in this case, which allow us to sort of like research how things are and improve the security baseline over time.
Yeah. We do have to acknowledge that we have a little bit of an advantage by owning Heroku, but, I've taken this philosophy to other things that we don't own, spent some time with finance, and, whether it's our department that pays or another department that pays, as long as finance understands that it's going to the entire company, there are ways to work around this kind of funny money so you can take out financing from the equation. And it's been successful in other areas as well.
Cool. Questions? Yeah. I see a couple of hands. One here, one there, one there.
Yeah, thank you. That was a great presentation, by the way. Thanks a lot. Very informative. What is the scope of the applications that you were targeting here? Because obviously you have kind of those that are supporting the organization and those that are facing the client, the organization.
Yes. So we are not Salesforce's product security team. So our mandate is operational applications. So really marketing, sales, IT, the benefits team, things like that. So it's often applications that are employee facing primarily.
Hey, over here, waving. So now that you've basically provided the platform for people to be able to be, secure by default, are you considering actually, putting in place any rules that actually, a deviation from that and turning stuff off is like a hard no-no? and like actually sort of enforcing security best practices now that you consider that it is easy enough?
So in the third-party space, for sure, because there are certain companies from a contractual perspective that are complicated. And so entering into, add-on relationships with those complicates those matters. So there are areas where we definitely kind of have to draw a line. But I think as a team, what we found is we've done this work. It's been about 3 years. We haven't spent a ton of time on this tool because we have so many challenges to face that it's kind of great to say, we hit a baseline that we're really happy with. Let's move on to some other challenges where we do have to have stronger arms.
Yeah, and ultimately to get the sort of like resources and investment, it really helps to gain that visibility first, to be able to then say, okay, this is how much of this thing X we are using, and now can we get, whatever budget, headcount, whatever it is that you need in order to go target, right? Whether it's enforcing strong authentication or whether it's doing actual automated code reviews or whatnot. Those things can sort of like be plugged in now that we have an automated way to go about doing it in the first place.
Cool. Thanks very much.
Yep.
You can touch on my question there. So I was going to ask, when moving from a kind of a gated process to a more broad, kind of less deep process of security audit, are you considering doing automation of some of the more complex parts, like code review and pen testing? And is that in your future plans?
Do you mean for this process or for other processes that we might own?
For both.
In general.
So for this, I would love to get into some static analysis. We do have lots of static analysis engines at Salesforce, so we just need to carve out the dev time to hook them up. But I think that would be a great scalable process as long as there aren't a ton of false positives that would bury the team and kind of helping with that. For other processes, there are things legitimately where we still have to do manual work. Like my team owns vendor security for Salesforce, so we do a lot of third-party assessments, and that's a much harder space to just entirely automate. So we do manual work as well. The nice thing is we can pick and choose. So there are a couple other domains where we've done asset management almost exactly like this after this project, and being able to say these are the areas of scope where we've automated heavily so that we can focus our manual time over here has been able to give my team the ability to cover a much broader portfolio of things and kind of help my leadership understand certain things are a bigger challenge. These things are much more automatable. So whenever you can give us, dev dollars, we can uplift these things. And whenever you can give us headcount, we can uplift these things.
And if I may add, I guess that you can also take a sort of like a staggered approach where by looking at some metrics such as, the size of the application, the utilization of the application, whether or not the application is tied to the corporate domain, so you assume is an externally facing application. You can sort of like try to create groups of them and start targeting those that obviously seem like the most critical ones. Because obviously, I think that the whole premise here is that we are just not going to be able to scale, at the same speed as the company grows. And so we really need to start thinking about a different approach. And we've seen that this sort of like gaining visibility to then uplift the security baseline really works for us.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, Chris, what do you got?
It's an easy one. Have you given any consideration to opening this up so other companies who aren't Salesforce can use the same functionality within Heroku to bring themselves up to the same kind of level?
Yes, we have. So we did a similar work for our internal Salesforce, core Salesforce usage. And we were able to get the tooling open sourced sometime after going live. I would hope that there is the opportunity to do the same for both. The intake process, although that's kind of like just a relatively simple form that collects whichever details you care about. But the more automation side of things and the monitoring side of the application, that definitely is something that we should consider doing.
Yeah. We thought about it. One of the bigger challenges with kind of the auto provisioning piece ended up being very Salesforce specific because of the way we did it. So that that part didn't make sense to open source, and just the dashboard itself I think is great, but people would really be missing that other piece. So we thought about ways where we can figure that out. We're looking at it. The other thing that might happen is they might just, like, it's been so successful, we've had conversations about just building it into the product itself, because there's a lot more demand these days for this kind of asset management in any platform. You know, people have lots of something and they want to be able to see all of it.
See a couple of hands up here. There, here.
Just looked at your numbers. You have roughly 1.3 users per application, which is not that many. So I assume because of the free nature of your service, you must have lots of zombie applications which are built and then not used. So how do you hunt zombies?
One thing I should clarify there is that those users are developers, not front-end users. So there is a disproportionate number. So like one of the applications that's built on this platform is our ticketing intake system for like IT tickets. So there's actually like 40,000 users of that platform and maybe 35 developers. So they're you know, because they're an aggregate, they don't really show the different environments. There probably are some zombie applications, honestly, or like QA applications, dev applications. Fair play. But the actual business impact isn't shown super well by the number of users, because that's just the number of developers.
I just want to hear.
Thanks. Very informative. You've obviously made a great process for making new apps going through this method. Do you find that there are some apps that don't fit the Heroku platform that have been going to the other platforms you mentioned at the beginning? And also, how have you managed the other platforms as part of this? So you mentioned Amazon and Google and Microsoft Cloud platforms early on. How does that fit into this process now?
It's a very good question. So we have another team within enterprise security that does a lot of infrastructure work, and we've worked with them on like AWS and things, because Heroku isn't great if you need like a data lake or something, like a really high volume data environment. So we do have AWS and GCP environments in use at the company, and those just right now, because they aren't to the volume or degree that this one was, and they generally come from more like IT-funded teams now, because they're much larger implementations in this kind of like easy business app style. They are bigger projects and usually take a little more manual investment. We haven't done like a super scaled like AWS tool in the same way for these kind of internal apps, just because the demand, we haven't needed it because we've done it this way. Good. Thank you so much. We'll see you all later.
Thank you.